May 17, 1944. Myitkyina Airfield, northern Burma. The jungle exhaled heat like a living thing. Thick, wet air clung to the teak trees and elephant grass that surrounded the airstrip, a narrow scar of packed red earth carved into the wilderness by Japanese engineers 2 years prior. Lieutenant Colonel Maruyama Fusataro stood in the watchtower, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the empty sky above the Irrawaddy River Valley. His garrison, 800 men of the 114th Infantry Regiment, had held this airfield through monsoons and supply shortages, through malaria and the constant threat of Chinese guerrillas filtering down from the hills. They had held because Tokyo had told them Myitkyina was vital, that it was the keystone of the entire Burma front, that losing it would sever the lifeline to China and collapse the southern flank of the coal prosperity sphere. Maruyama lowered his binoculars and checked his watch. Idro 917 hours. His morning report lay half-finished on the desk behind him. Enemy activity minimal, morale stable, rice stores adequate for another month. He reached for his pen, then he heard the sound. Not the roar of engines he had trained himself to recognize, the low growl of Allied bombers, the high whine of P-40 fighties. This was different. A whisper, a rush of wind through fabric. He turned toward the western tree line and saw them emerging from the dawn haze like paper ghosts. Gliders, dozens of them. Silent, engineless aircraft descending in perfect formation, their wings catching the early light as they banked toward the airfield. For a moment Maruyama did not move. He had read intelligence reports about Allied glider experiments, fragile contraptions built from plywood and canvas, designed to carry supplies, perhaps a few men, toys. Curiosities. Nothing that could threaten a fortified position. He watched the first glider touch down on the far end of the runway, then the second, then the third. Soldiers poured out before the aircraft had even stopped moving, Americans in jungle fatigues, weapons raised, moving with a coordination that made his stomach tighten. By the time Maruyama reached for the alarm bell, 20 gliders had landed. By the time the alarm finished ringing, 40. By the time his men scrambled to their positions, the Americans were already inside the perimeter. 200 troops had arrived in silence. The airfield fell in 6 hours. The weapon that shattered Japanese confidence in Burma was not a tank or a bomber, or a new rifle. It was a glider. The Waco CG-4A. A fabric and tube steel aircraft that could carry 13 soldiers or a jeep or a 75mm howitzer directly into combat without requiring a runway, without making a sound, without giving the enemy more than 60 seconds of warning. To the Japanese commanders who had spent 3 years mastering jungle warfare, who had conquered Singapore and Rangoon and driven the British back to India, the glider was an absurdity. It violated every principle they understood about logistics and supply line. An army moved on roads, on railways, on rivers. An army needed fuel and infocross. An army could not simply materialize from the sky in wooden boxes held together with glue. But the Americans did not fight wars according to Japanese principle. The story of the glider assault on Myitkyina begins not in Burma but in the factories of Ohio and the airfields of North Carolina, where the United States had spent 2 years solving a problem that most militaries considered unsolvable: how to deliver large numbers of infantry and heavy equipment behind enemy lines without relying on parachutes. Paratroopers were useful, but they scattered on landing. They dropped with only what they could carry. They could seize a position but could not hold it without resupply. The glider, developed in secrecy by a coalition of aircraft manufacturers and tested in the pine forests of Fort Bragg, offered an alternative. It could land intact. It could deliver a fighting unit at full strength, with crew-served weapons and ammunition, ready to operate as a cohesive force the moment the skids stopped sliding. The British had experimented with gliders first, using them in the 1942 raid on Norway's heavy water plant. The Germans had deployed gliders spectacularly at Eben Amiel in 1940, landing assault troops on top of a Belgian fortress and capturing it in 20 minutes. But those had been small-scale operations, precision strikes involving a handful of aircraft. What the Americans planned for Burma was different in scale and ambition. Operation Thursday, conceived by the eccentric British General Audie Wingate and executed by American air transport units, called for an entire brigade, 3,000 men, to be flown 200 miles behind Japanese lines, and deposited in the jungle without a single landing strip. The plan required 2,225 gliders, 100 C-47 transport planes, and a willingness to accept catastrophic losses. General Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, had called it the most dangerous airlift ever attempted. Wingate had called it essential. The Japanese High Command had called it impossible. The gliders launched from Waco Airfield in India on the night of March 5. Each CG-4A was attached by a nylon rope to a C-47 Dakota, which would tow it across the mountains and release it over the drop zone. The pilots were young, most under 25, and few had more than 100 hours in gliders. They flew without engines, without radios, without any way to correct course once the tow rope detached. They navigated by moonlight and instinct, watching the dark mass of the jungle below and praying they would not hit a tree. 40 gliders crashed on the first night. 31 men died before they even reached the enemy. The survivors landed in a clearing called Broadway, hacked out of the jungle by advance teams, and within 12 hours had constructed a functional airstrip capable of receiving transport planes. Within a week, they had fortified positions and begun raiding Japanese supply convoys. The Japanese commanders in Rangoon did not believe the initial reports. Lieutenant General Kawabe Masakazu, head of the Burma Area Army, dismissed the glider landings as a diversion. A small unit, he reasoned, perhaps a reconnaissance team that had gotten lucky. He ordered local garrisons to monitor the situation but took no immediate action. It was not until Allied radio intercepts confirmed the presence of an entire brigade, complete with artillery, mules and medical staff, that Kawabe understood what had happened. The Americans had not infiltrated his lines. They had bypassed them entirely. They had rewritten the geography of the battlefield. Kawabe convened an emergency meeting with his staff. The minutes of that meeting, captured after the war, reveal a command structure in crisis. One colonel argued that the glider landings were a fluke, that the Americans had expended enormous resources for minimal gain. Another pointed out that the enemy now controlled a staging area deep in Japanese territory, within striking distance of the critical railway connecting Burma to China. A third noted, with barely concealed alarm, that if the Allies could land 3,000 men by glider, they could land 30,000. The entire Japanese defensive strategy, built on the assumption that dense jungle and mountain ranges provided natural barriers, had been rendered obsolete. Kawabe ordered a counterattack. It failed. The Chindits, Wingate's long-range penetration force, had dug in and received continuous aerial resupply. Japanese infantry units, accustomed to facing enemies who wilted when their supply lines were cut, instead found themselves battling a force that had no supply lines to cut. Every night, C-47s flew in food, ammunition and reinforcement. Every night, gliders descended with jeeps and mortars and medical supplies. The Japanese threw regiment after regiment at the Allied positions and watched them dissolve under coordinated artillery and airstrikes. By May, Kawabe had lost 6,000 men. By June he had lost Myitkyina. The psychological impact of the glider assaults extended far beyond a single airfield. For 3 years the Japanese military had operated on a foundational belief that their soldiers were tougher, more disciplined, more willing to endure hardship than any Western force. They had marched through Malaya faster than the British thought possible. They had survived on minimal rations, carried artillery through swamps, fought effectively in conditions that hospitalized European troops. This resilience, they believed, was a strategic advantage. The Allies could not match it. The Allies, with their reliance on motorized transport and elaborate supply chains, would collapse the moment the terrain became difficult. The glider operations proved otherwise. The Americans had not tried to match Japanese endurance. They had made endurance irrelevant. Instead of marching through the jungle, they flew over it. Instead of building roads, they landed where roads did not exist. Instead of adapting to the environment, they had engineered a method to ignore it, and they had done so with a vehicle that Japanese intelligence had classified as experimental and of limited utility. Major General Tanaka Shinichi, who commanded the 18th Division during the Myitkyina campaign, later wrote in his unpublished memoirs that the gliders represented a kind of warfare we did not know existed. He described watching from a hillside as a formation of CG-4As descended onto a rice paddy his troops had mined and fortified. The gliders landed in a staggered line, disgorged troops and machine guns, and established a defensive perimeter within minutes. His forces had spent 2 days preparing that position. The Americans had neutralized it in 2 hours. Tanaka ordered his men to withdraw, then sat on a fallen log and stared at the empty gliders, their fabric skins rippling in the wind. "We were fighting an enemy," he wrote, "who could afford to throw away an airplane after one use." That image, the disposable glider, became a symbol among Japanese officers of a larger, more disturbing truth. The Americans were not winning through superior tactics or better soldiers. They were winning through abundance. The Waco CG-4A cost worth $15,000 to manufacture, roughly the price of a mid-range truck. The United States built 13,909 of them. Most were used once and abandoned. Japanese commanders, who reused every scrap of material, who flew planes until they fell apart, who had entire units dedicated to salvaging rifle brass, could not process this level of waste. It was not merely extravagance. It was a different conception of war itself. The Japanese fought as though resources were finite, as though every bullet and every bandage had to be accounted for. The Americans fought as though resources were infinite, as though the factories back home could simply produce whatever the front required. And the terrifying part was that in practical terms they could. Between 1942 and 1945, American industry manufactured 297,000 aircraft. Japan over the same period produced. The United States built gliders as throwaway delivery vehicles because it could afford to build gliders as throwaway delivery vehicles. It fielded entire squadrons of transport planes solely to tow those gliders, and when pilots complained about the danger, it trained more pilots. The logistical infrastructure required to sustain Operation Thursday, the fuel, the spare parts, the mechanics, the air traffic controllers, would have consumed the entire annual budget of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. For the Americans, it was a supporting element of one campaign in one theater of a global war. This disparity manifested in the smallest details. Captured Japanese soldiers at Myitkyina told interrogators that they had been more demoralized by American rations than by American firepower. The glider troops ate canned fruit, peanut butter, chocolate bars and coffee. They received cigarettes and chewing gum. They had enough food to discard what they did not like. The Japanese defenders, by contrast, were on half rations, supplementing their diet with foraged bamboo shoots and whatever animals they could trap. Medical supplies had run out in April. Ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per rifle, and then they watched Americans unload crates of grenades from a glider and leave half of them stacked by the runway because carrying them was inconvenient. One Japanese officer, captured during the final assault on Myitkyina, refused to speak for 3 days. On the 4th day, he asked his interrogator a single question. "How many gliders does America have?" The interrogator said 14,000. The officer nodded slowly. Then he asked, "How many do you use more than once?" The interrogator admitted he did not know, but probably not many. The officer closed his eyes. "Then you have already won the war." He was correct, though the fighting would continue for another 15 months. The Burma campaign revealed a fundamental asymmetry that Japanese strategists had failed to account for in 1941 when they attacked Pearl Harbor. They had assumed that American industrial capacity, while large, would be diluted across multiple fronts. They had assumed that democracy would slow decision-making, that public opinion would demand a negotiated peace after early defeat. They had assumed that Americans, comfortable and individualistic, would not endure the sacrifices required for total war. Every assumption had been wrong. American production had not been diluted. It had been amplified. Democracy had not slowed mobilization. It had provided a moral framework that sustained it. And the American public had not demanded peace. It had demanded victory and accepted the costs without flinching. The glider became a symbol of this unexpected resolve. It was not a glamorous weapon. It did not feature in propaganda posters or Hollywood films. It was awkward, dangerous, and ungainly. Pilots called it the flying coffin. Troops called it the canvas casket. But it worked. It delivered men and machines to places they had no business reaching. And in doing so, it collapsed defensive lines that had been considered impregnable. After Myitkyina, the Japanese abandoned the strategy of defending fixed positions in Burma. They retreated toward Thailand, burning their supply depots as they went, because they understood that any position could now be flanked, surrounded, and cut off by an enemy who did not need roads. The final irony was that the Japanese had possessed the technical knowledge to build their own gliders. Several prototypes existed, including the Kokusai Ku-8, a larger and more robust design than the American CG-4A. But Japan lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce them. It lacked the transport planes to tow them. It lacked the fuel to fly the missions. Most critically, it lacked the strategic vision to see gliders as anything other than a novelty. Japanese doctrine emphasized offense, aggression, decisive engagement. The glider was a defensive tool, a method for sustaining troops in isolated positions. It did not fit the samurai ethos of seeking battle. So the prototypes sat in warehouses while the Americans deployed thousands. By the summer of 1945, the glider had evolved. Larger models, like the CG-13 and the British Hamilcar, could carry light tanks. Experimental versions were being designed to tow smaller gliders, creating chains of aircraft that could deliver an entire battalion in a single wave. None of these advanced models saw combat. The atomic bombs dropped in August rendered them unnecessary, but their existence, documented in design schematics and production schedules, told the same story the Waco had told over Myitkyina, that American industry had not merely met wartime demand, but had exceeded it, had continued innovating even when innovation was no longer required. Japanese officers, imprisoned in camps from Guam to Australia, read about these developments in translated newspapers. Some requested technical manuals, trying to understand how the logistics had worked. Others refused to read anything, retreating into silence. A few, like Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, one of the architects of the Malaya campaign, wrote memoirs attempting to explain the defeat. Tsuji's account, published in 1952, includes a chapter on the Burma campaign. He describes the glider landings as the moment we understood the war was lost, not because Japan could not match the tactic, but because matching the tactic required an economy Japan did not have. We were fighting with swords, he wrote, and they were fighting with factories. The metaphor was imprecise but emotionally accurate. The samurai sword, the katana, was a symbol of Japanese martial culture. Handcrafted, revered, irreplaceable. Each blade took months to forge. Each represented a lineage, a tradition, a philosophy. The factory, by contrast, was impersonal, mechanical, endlessly replicating. It produced not art, but output. And in the algebra of total war, output mattered more than artistry. The glider was not beautiful. It was functional. It was expendable. It was effective. And there were thousands more where it came from. This realization, that industrial capacity could trump martial spirit, haunted the Japanese military establishment for decades. In the post-war years, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, former officers watched their country transform from an agrarian empire into an industrial democracy. They saw factories rise where temples had stood. They saw assembly lines producing automobiles instead of aircraft. They saw efficiency replace ritual. And some of them, in private writings and interviews, admitted that the lesson of the glider had been correct. That survival in the modern world required not the perfection of the sword, but the mastery of the assembly line. The Waco CG-4A itself did not survive the war as a platform. Most were scrapped or left to rot on airfields from France to the Philippines. A few were preserved in museums, their fabric skins replaced, their wooden frames reinforced with modern material. They sit now in climate-controlled hangars, beside Spitfires and Mustangs, and all the other icons of aerial combat. Visitors walk past them quickly. They do not look impressive. They do not look capable of changing the outcome of battles, let alone war. But on May 17, 1944, above a red dirt airstrip in the Burmese jungle, they looked like the future. They looked like an enemy that could not be starved, could not be isolated, could not be stopped by destroying its roads or bridges or supply depot. They looked like a nation that had solved war the way it solved every other problem, with overwhelming resources, relentless innovation, and a willingness to waste material if waste achieved the objective. Lieutenant Colonel Maruyama, who had watched that first wave descend, survived the battle for Myitkyina. He retreated with the remnants of his regiment into the hills, was cut off during the monsoon, and surrendered in August with 63 men, all that remained of his original 800. In his interrogation, he was asked what he remembered most about the American attack. He did not mention the artillery or the airstrikes, or the superior numbers. He mentioned the gliders. They should not have worked, he said, but they did. That was when I knew we had misunderstood everything. The interrogator noted that the subject appeared exhausted and malnourished, but coherent. He did not elaborate on what Maruyama meant by everything. He did not need to. The gliders had said it all.